So hopefully you can see this on your screen. Um, it's a little bit of I feel like I should do a little bit of a disclaimer. Nobody actually knows what's going to happen. We hardly knew what was going to happen with COVID. We certainly don't exactly know what's going to happen with the flu. There's some fascinating information that is available, and we will get to that. I want to, before we go, I want to sort of start with the summary of where we are with to date with COVID. Now, I did these statistics yesterday, and so they are remarkably current. Although even the ones you get on the internet are not actually what happened yesterday. So what I know today is that overnight, the hospital went from like no people or 6 people to 20 people. That spectrum has also seen a significant surge. That I just heard today that there are now 90 colleagues that have contracted COVID, and disturbingly, it's not patient to colleague transmission. It is colleague to colleague transmission is what they're telling me. And so they're saying, keep wearing your masks, keep washing your hands, keep sanitizing, keep 6 feet apart, because we're wearing out and people are letting down their guard, and we're seeing a little blip up. Be that as it may, overall, if you will look at what you can see, you'll notice that in the ways that we can measure how well we're doing, Kent County is doing an outstanding job. They have been doing an outstanding job from the beginning, and they are still doing an outstanding job. Our case-specific mortality is at 1.6. That is unbelievably low. 85% of all the cases in Kent County have occurred in the under 60 population. That is also outstanding. Kent County has done over 500,000 tests. The failure rate on the tests are less than 0.2%. That is an extremely successful testing situation. Michigan overall is not quite so rosy a perspective. As you will notice, the state as a whole has a case-specific mortality of about 5.1%. The last week has seen a little bump up. And the last 30 days has seen a lower rate, but it's still lower than the overall positive rate from going back 4 months. So the CDC has defined hotspots as having over 10,000 positives in a week. And if you look at the CDC map, Michigan is a warm spot, not a hot spot. There are now, if you look down to the United States totals, 5 hotspot states. Now, for me, as a Mercy colleague, what they have said is, don't go there. If you go there, don't expect to use your COVID benefit if something happens to you. So I don't go there. I was supposed to be going to a dog show this weekend in Wisconsin. We canceled it. There are 11 warm spots. There are 11 lukewarm spots. There's 11 cool spots. There's 7 cool spots, and there's 5 cold spots. Ironically, the cold spots are mostly in the northern United States. 3 of the 5 are Maine, Vermont, and New Hampshire. They really are cold spots. If you look at the world, you'll notice that the case-specific mortality everywhere in Western Europe has dropped significantly for the last 3 months. So England, which is still one of the higher case-specific mortalities, about 7%, but a lot of places are in the 2.8, 2.5, 3.1, 1.7. Almost all of them are above, though, the United States case-specific mortality of 2.77. So the United States is doing truly a good job. I mean, you wouldn't necessarily be able to tell that from the news, but almost all of the data becomes a political football. I want to acquaint you with what's emerging as another way to gauge the impact of COVID. People have really struggled with, is this a COVID? Should we say that COVID caused this death? Did it really cause it? Is it causing death some other way? Are people underreporting? Are they overreporting? So one of the things you can do that's a little more objective is this concept of excess mortality. The idea is you can look at, over large areas. So this is looked at over the United States and say, well, in 6 months, about how many people die in the United States over a 6-month period. And you can say for 6 months, say from March to August, what if we look back and took an average of the last 6 years from March to August? Turns out you have about 1.1 million people that die, all causes, all comers. And then you can say, well, what about now? What's happened this last August, and how do we compare that? Well, lo and behold, there's a pretty significant excess over what you would expect. And you can see there a group of scholars wrote a letter into the Journal of the American Medical Association. That's that reference there that you'll see at the bottom. And they said that, we've calculated that there are about 225,000 excess deaths, or a 20% increase over what would be predicted over the last 6 months average. And as you can see there, 10 states account for the majority of those excess deaths. And I listed their initials there. Unless we're tempted to look for a political explanation, they're pretty evenly split between Democratic administrations and Republican administrations, 6 and 4. So no basis to think that there is some party-specific explanation for policies and approaches. One of the fascinating dilemmas that you're still left with is, are these direct or indirect? Are these from COVID, or are these a consequence of people being afraid of COVID? And it's still fairly difficult to separate that. But one of the fascinating things is that there are several diseases that show spikes during this period of excess death. Curiously, cardiovascular disease, diabetes, and there are 2 separate sequential peaks in deaths from Alzheimer's. It's fairly difficult to separate exactly why, but it's hard to escape the thought that people have avoided care. They also said it's difficult to gauge the impact of what are called the social determinants of health. That includes things like benefits and employment and housing and all these other things that impact how people seek and get health care. But I mean, I know that we have had any number of cases, just anecdotally in our practice, where people said, no, I don't want mom to go in because she'll be frightened in the hospital and I can't visit her, and they won't let anybody in. And so there are people that clearly avoid healthcare right now, and we know that they shut down all elective healthcare for quite a while and just restarted in the last little while. So that's another way to sort of gauge the impact, but very clearly there has been a dramatic impact in the last 6 months on mortality related to this pandemic. What I wanted to do now is just sort of step back and do a little bit of review before we get to flu and coronaviruses, and just give you a little virology 101, as it were. One of the questions you can ask, and I always kind of forget this, viruses are not in fact alive by most conventional definitions of what a living organism is. You can see there, you're supposed to be able to independently grow, develop, and reproduce, and viruses don't do that. A virus is considered an infectious particle. There are other kinds of infectious particles, even simpler. There's something called a prion. Prion diseases are, to me, more terrifying than viral diseases. Viruses were discovered, quote unquote, in the late 1880s. A plant virus, a tobacco mosaic virus, was the first virus ever discovered. Human viruses waited till later in that, like in 1898. I always wondered, you find out people you didn't know, like, why did they call the hospital in Maryland Walter Reed? Well, this is why. Walter Reed discovered the yellow fever virus in 1901. The term virus is derived from the Latin word for slimy liquid. Go figure. Or poison. A virus particle is called a virion. It has RNA or DNA and a protein shell, and sometimes a lipid capsule. Viruses are characterized by the kind of genetic material they have in. Some of the familiar viruses that you will know, herpes viruses, pox viruses, cold viruses, or DNA viruses. Turns out that coronavirus and influenza are RNA viruses. It can also further be classified by shape and whether they have a lipid envelope. Coronavirus has a lipid envelope. There are fairly key elements of virus-tope interactions that virus-host interactions that determine whether or not and how the infection occurs. One of the things that's come into focus lately is this idea of inoculum size. When people have posed the question, why do people seem to be getting less sick in the last 3 months from coronavirus than they did in the first 3 months? And the most convincing argument seems to be that it relates to inoculum size. That if you get a really large exposure, that's when we tended to see a lot of injury in the host from the exuberant immune response that the host created against the virus. A lot of the damage was done by the inflammatory mediators that were triggered by the second wave of viruses breaking out of the hosts of the cell, the cells of the host rather, and the body damaged itself in trying to fight it. These are the net results. You may get no infection, you may get an abortive infection with very limited viral replication. So if, for instance, a virus attacked to which you are immune, your immune system would shut it down and recognize it and eliminate it, and so you wouldn't get an infection. You can get what we have seen in this pandemic, asymptomatic infections, symptomatic infections. What we have not seen are persistent or latent infections. You will have heard of persistent or latent infections in things like chickenpox and herpes viruses that can have repeated reemergences. Shingles is the sort of latent expression of an earlier chickenpox infection. So that's what that means. This is a diagram of how an influenza virus interacts with a cell and damages it. Now the slide after this, you'll see there's little 1s, 2s, 3A, 3B, 4, 5, 5B, 6, and 7. There are elaborate explanations for what these all represent. I am not going to go through those, but you can if you are excited and interested. This is a diagram of how an influenza virus would infect a cell and then eventually reproduce itself and go on to infect some other cell. This is the explanation of all of that. Way too elaborate to go through. This is my briefer explanation. So you can see the virus hijacks the cell process, it reproduces itself, it then breaks out of the cell membrane, it spreads copies of itself. That happens over and over. The person infected, called the host, irritated by the infection, then coughs or sneezes, or in other kinds of viruses, diarrhea and chickenpox, you have open sores. Viruses have different capacities to survive outside of the host. And that has a lot to do with how broadly they spread and how easily they infect other people. Okay, let's do, now we'll get to a specific. We said coronavirus was an RNA virus. There are 7 known strains. 4 cause mild colds. Almost all of us have probably had these. 3 strains have been catastrophic. 2003, 2012, and now the one we're living through. There are 4 strains of the flu, influenza, creatively named A, B, C, and D. 2, A and B, cause significant disease in people. 1, A, is the one that causes all the pandemics. The genetic material does what they call resorting itself as it moves between hosts. So it has 2 different kinds of hosts. It has an animal host and a human host. And when it goes back into the animal host, it can come out with a different arrangement of its nuclear material, creates different antigens. The antigens allow it not to be recognized the way it was the first time it went in, and so it can cause disease again. That's why we get flu shots every year. They try to create a vaccine that has the most contemporary arrangement, what they think is the most likely antigens that we need to recognize, knowing that we have some protection from other strains that have gone before it. So we may not have nearly as aggressive responses if it's completely novel to us. And so the flu shot tries to, the people, you know, that are in the World Health Organization and the CDC and all these other, all the drug companies that existence depends on making influenza vaccines. They're all trying to figure out what's the newest strain, what's going to happen, and what kind of mix do they need? What mix of A's and B's should they put in the current vaccine? It's different in the Southern Hemisphere than the Northern Hemisphere. Anyway, there's a lot of educated guesswork that goes in. When they guess right, we get less flu through the country, and if they guess wrong, we get more. B is only human. It does not have an animal host, so it does not tend to cause pandemics. It does not resort. It does not, and usually every year they try to figure out which B is going around and combine B's and A's in a vaccine. So frequently you will have heard of A related to the animal that they think it came out of. So there was a time when we had swine flus, or times we've had avian flus. And now let's talk a little bit more about what happened this year. So as you might imagine, the flu shows up at different times in different parts of the world. The summer in the Southern Hemisphere is different than the summer in the Winter Hemisphere, and the fall in the, the summer in the Southern Hemisphere is different than the Southern and the Northern Hemisphere, and the seasons all have their different. So the flu season in the southern hemisphere tends to come before the flu season in the northern hemisphere. It's roughly March through September. So in the southern hemisphere, they have just finished their flu season. Our own CDC still aggregates much of this worldwide data, and I was able to get reports of that data and reporting this to you. And so we're going to look at a little bit about what happened down there. And this was from the CDC MMWR volume. In the southern hemisphere, countries of Australia, Chile, and South Africa, only 33 positive flu tests were detected in Australia among 60,000 specimens, 12 in 21,000, and 6 among 2,000 from South Africa. You can see basically the articles that wrote about this said the flu season was a non-starter in the southern hemisphere. In July of 2017 through 2019, they had a 13.7% positive rate among 178,000 tests, and there was 0.06% positive among 83,000 tests this year. So the flu just essentially vanished in the southern hemisphere. Everybody is very hopeful that the explanation was, well, everybody was keeping 6 feet apart and they were wearing masks and they were washing their hands, and so nobody got the flu either. And the flu has the benefit of, 1, having an immunization, and 2, having some level of herd immunity, which COVID does not. So this seems kind of obvious. 1, you need to get a flu shot. 2, you need to wear masks. 3, you need to wash your hands a lot. 4, you need to keep safe distances. And 5, you need to stay home if you're sick. So this is potentially pretty good news, but it's mostly good news if we relax too much and we wear out in following these things. One of the things we'll do is, we're going to go through now, is to figure out, well, we can't for sure know that it's just not going to show up. So what are we going to do? How are we going to manage people that seem to get sick? What are we going to do? So one of the things that we pointed out earlier is that the current COVID tests, you could see that the failure rate in Kent County was stunningly low. The COVID tests are accurate, more accurate than our flu tests have been. Now, it's kind of hard to know why. Some of it's technique, and so it's possible that the people that are doing the testing have gotten really good at swabbing people's noses. I know that I felt like I got my brains biopsied, and I'm sure other people have shared that experience. But that willingness to really make sure you got a good specimen, I think, is going to stand us in better stead when people go to do the flu test. Now, the 15-minute version of the COVID platform is not as accurate as the current tests we're doing. The 15-minute version of the flu test, the rapid flu, is similarly less accurate than other ways of doing flu tests. We're going to look at an algorithm here in a minute that will tell us sort of how to decide what to test for and when. This is the algorithm that the Trinity has put out for all of its facilities. There is, as you can imagine, essentially a complete overlap with symptoms. Symptomatology is not going to let us distinguish between these two viruses. So we have this sort of decision tree. Have you had COVID? Have you not had COVID? If you've had it in the last 3 months, well, we certainly aren't going to test for it because we won't know what to do with that result. It can stay positive for at least 3 months. And then we'll say, well, is flu prevalent in the community? That will depend on what our public health department is doing and telling us. Do we have flu shown up? Do we have positive flu tests? If it's not, then we'll simply test for COVID if you haven't had it. If the flu is prevalent, then we'll test for both. If you've already had COVID and we don't need to test you and flu is not prevalent, we'll have to make sure that we think of other viruses that could be causing this or other conditions. If flu has shown up, then we'll test for it. This will probably, I'm sure in real time, we'll still have some situations that make us scratch our head. But this is the basic framework for making the decisions when we think that we may have more than one virus that's at play. The responses to COVID certainly will not change. Those processes are already in place. You know, we will continue with the isolation and the quarantine and the decision-making that we've had before. Once there is some prevalence of flu in the community, then we will also do exactly what we used to do with treating people with Tamiflu, and be confirmed and get confirmation and guidance from test results and from prevalence information of the disease in the community. All right. Last thing I want to talk about, and we're coming right up to the end of our half an hour, is I thought you'd be interested to know where we are with the COVID vaccines. There are now 11 large-scale human trial phase 3s going on. Phase 1 is mostly animal studies. Phase 2 is very limited, is further animal studies and very limited human trials. And then phase 3 are the widespread trials that you need to produce data in advance of getting a vaccine certified to be able to distribute and give widely. Phase 4 is post-release symptom recording. It's pretty hard to find. There's 92 vaccines overall. There are 44 somewhere in the process. It's fairly hard. I looked at countless graphs summarizing these. I thought the summary article from the New York Times probably did the best job at making it simple and digestible. It gets confusing because fairly few of these things are sponsored by a single drug company. A bunch of them are sponsored by international consortiums of more than one drug company. What bothers me a little bit is that the majority of the shots that are in development are a 2-shot vaccine process. Many of them have really intimidating logistics. A number of them, I think this was true of the avian flu shot a number of years ago, has to be stored at -70. And so those are hard to imagine really widespread distribution because you have a bottleneck of having to have them stored at a place that has that capacity and then delivered at that same place. I think that's why we all had to go to the health department to get our avian or H1N1 vaccines. One of the more encouraging things is that Johnson & Johnson has built their vaccine on a process that they had managed and delivered to create a vaccine against Ebola when the Ebola vaccine was created in that outbreak in Africa. That was 10 years ago. And they're using the same technology most of them find a benign virus. They marry the genetic material from the coronavirus to the benign virus. They produce that, they kill it, and then they put it in the vaccine to be injected, so that it creates the immunity that you want to create by having exposure to the coronavirus particles that are needed to be exposed to create the antibodies that to protect us. So they were able to use the same, it's an adenovirus carrier virus, and it was the same one that they used for Ebola, which is why I think they had so much experience with it. Anyway, they're also in phase 3. It has not got the same storage logistics, and it's a single shot delivery. So I would watch for that. Because of the way the government has gone about this, if you get far enough, they have these giant billion-dollar lucrative contracts that they're awarding, presuming you get far enough to produce hundreds of thousands of doses. And so AstraZeneca and Johnson & Johnson and Meridian have all got these contracts pending. So there's a giant carrot out there for many of these folks. What I've read is that these will be, I mean, if they work and there's no hitches. So the AstraZeneca has already hit one hitch. They had to stop their trial in England because of a patient that came down with a particular condition called transverse myelitis. It was a single patient. They stopped the trial. They reviewed it. In England, they've started back up, but the FDA still hasn't let them start back up in the United States. Johnson & Johnson just had to suspend their trial for another single patient that had something, we don't know what. These things are pretty, from what I read, these are very common parts of the process. It's part of the reason that it's so crazy to think that we will have, yet in 2020, an actual vaccine. Most, of these folks that are shrewd watchers say at the very earliest, maybe 2021 early. Probably after this initial set of vaccines are available, you'll get a second phase of vaccines that will be developed to be delivered without a shot. Some of them are using, a nasal delivery, like we have a flu influenza that's available for nasal delivery, and some of them are actually going to be on an inhaler platform, like a puffer or Ventolin or a nebulizer kind of system. So you'll inhale it directly into your lungs, or you'll inhale it into the nasal mucosa. The idea is it will probably do most of its work in the respiratory mucosa, with enhanced IgA or some of the antibodies that are most active in that respiratory epithelium, and have less systemic impact, ideally, and so probably be better tolerated overall. But those are just the state of things now and what to look for. Okay, I'm sorry if I seem to have rushed through that. We've covered a lot, but we're done with the main content, and if people have questions, I'm good with questions.
Okay, what I'm going to do here, I'm just going to stop recording, and then why don't you go ahead and stop sharing the screen, Ron, so we can see